Chapter 2, 4 Stars. It was a Tuesday, of course, the 7th of November, 2000. On that first general election day of the new millennium, voters in the city of Louisville and its surrounding county of Jefferson approved a referendum to merge their governments into a single entity. The 3 previous attempts to do so had ended in failure, but after 40 years of trying, Louisville's pro-merger forces finally prevailed. No one noticed. That same day, of course, everyone's eyes turned further south, to Florida, where the Sunshine State and its butterfly ballots and its hanging chads were causing electoral chaos. The outcome of the presidential election of 2000 between Vice President Al Gore and Texas Governor George W. Bush hung in the balance. There were those pesky votes for Ralph Nader, those puzzling butterfly ballots for Pat Buchanan, those vexing dimples. My wife and I were sitting in a Louisville restaurant that evening watching election results roll in on a big screen TV. While we were there, the networks called and then uncalled Florida for Al Gore. Sometime in the middle of the night, they called and then uncalled Florida for George W. Bush. This is going to be fun, I thought to myself when I read the news the next morning. I'd voted for Al, but it wasn't going to bother me if Bush won. I couldn't muster the same level of respect for W as I'd had for his father, but I wasn't going to jump off a bridge if he became president. I just wanted to enjoy the show. In the last half of the 20th century and well into the next, a lot of American cities began to merge their governments with those of their surrounding counties. The advantages were obvious. There was money to be saved. The disadvantages were numerous, including higher taxes for some and the potential loss of local control. Louisville residents west of the 9th Street Divide were particularly worried that they would be disenfranchised, but regional pressures finally put the pro-merger forces over the top. Louisville's chief rivals, Indianapolis and Nashville, had done it. Perhaps more importantly, Louisville's rival to the east, Lexington, Kentucky, had done it. In Kentucky there is Louisville and then there is Kentucky, and the twain rarely meet. To this day, westbound travelers on Interstate 64 have to drive more than 100 miles from the West Virginia border and past Lexington before they'll see a single reference to Louisville on any of the interstate's road signs. Whether by oversight or by design, Louisville's conspicuous I-64 absence is emblematic of Kentucky's disdain for its principal city. Some of Louisville's residents return the unlove to their host state. Depending on one's point of view, Louisville is either urban and cool and Kentucky is country and cornpone, or Louisville is fake and Kentucky is real. Louisville is black and Kentucky is white. Louisville is liberal and Kentucky is conservative. But in an ironic twist, Louisville is red and Kentucky is blue, and the colorful departure from American political norms is due to a cultural force that transcends all other cultural forces: college basketball. It was a Saturday, the 19th of March, 1966. At 10 o'clock that night, for the first time in college basketball history, an all-white team from the University of Kentucky played against an all-black team from Texas Western for the NCAA Men's Collegiate Championship. The Miners from El Paso won, and the basketball world, and perhaps the nation, took notice. Maybe the game wasn't the seminal event that everyone wants it to be now. Bill Russell had already led San Francisco to a couple of national titles, and Oscar Robertson had done the same thing at Cincinnati. By the mid-1960s, a lot of black athletes were playing college basketball, and times were changing. Nevertheless, the 1966 championship game was a pretty big deal. At the very least, the outcome helped to drag the South, kicking and screaming, into the age of desegregation. After Kentucky's loss, one Lexington sports writer was heard to grouse. At least we're still the #1 white team in the country. A couple of years before that '66 title game, Kentucky's famous basketball coach, Adolph Rupp, made a few half-hearted efforts to recruit black players. In private, Rupp peppered his speech with racist vernacular, but he was under pressure from the university administration to integrate his team. The first athletic scholarship that the University of Kentucky basketball program ever offered to an African-American player was made in 1965 to Wesley Unsold, a standout center from Louisville. Unsold was so good that colleges across the country were tripping over themselves to recruit him, and the failure of Kentucky to offer Unsold a scholarship would have been a glaring admission of Rupp's inherent prejudice. Unsold ultimately chose to stay at home and play for the University of Louisville, in part to be close to his ailing father, and in part to avoid the raging prejudice he would have had to endure had he played in Kentucky's Southeastern Conference. Unsold's years at Louisville began the school's ascendance into college basketball's world of elite programs, and its fans began to clamor for a game with the University of Kentucky. But for years, Kentucky refused. They didn't want to denigrate their top-flight program by playing the upstart city school that was 70 miles away down I-64. But finally, in 1975, Louisville got its chance. The universities of Louisville and Kentucky both landed berths in the Final Four that year, and if they won their respective semifinal games, they would play each other for the national championship. All Kentucky had to do was beat Syracuse. All Louisville had to do was beat UCLA. A lot of Louisville families were divided by the Louisville-Kentucky rivalry, and they still are, but our house in those days was fairly nonpartisan. My father was a fan of both teams, and we often listened to Louisville and Kentucky games on the radio together, watched them on TV when we could, and we'd go see Louisville play in Freedom Hall, where JFK had given his speech, whenever we could get tickets. In those naive days before billion-dollar TV deals, freshmen weren't allowed to play varsity basketball, and my father and I would arrive early enough to watch at least some of the freshman game before the evening's varsity event. After one Frosh game in 1965, a huge young man came into the stands to watch the varsity game, and he took a seat a few rows in front of us. My father pointed at him. "Go ask him for his autograph," he told me. I crept down to where the big man was sitting, tapped him meekly on the shoulder, and offered him a piece of paper and a pencil. He politely obliged. The big man was Wesley Unseld. Unfortunately, I have no idea what happened to that piece of paper. It would be kind of cool to see it again, but I doubt that I ever will. It was a Sunday, the 29th of March, 1975. The busing violence that would roil the city of Louisville was still several months away, and few people in town had court orders or busing or desegregation on their minds that day. There was basketball to be played. In the first semifinal, Kentucky easily dispatched Syracuse. Now it was time for Louisville to do the same to UCLA. The Bruins were on the hunt for their 10th national championship under their coaching legend, John Wooden. Louisville's coach was Denny Crum, who'd played for Wooden at UCLA and who'd been his top assistant until he was offered the head coaching job at Louisville in 1971. When the game started, Louisville took a small lead, and they held it through halftime when they were up by 4. In the second half, the Bruins clawed their way back, and at the end of regulation, the game was tied. In overtime, Louisville once again took a small lead, but UCLA closed the gap to within a single basket. With 50 seconds to go, Louisville had a 1-point lead in the ball. In 1975, there was no shot clock and no three-point shot. There was also no double bonus for free throws. All Louisville had to do was to hold the ball and run out the clock. UCLA had no choice but to foul and force Louisville to hit the 1-and-1 from the free throw line. Denny Crum pulled his leading scorer, Alan Murphy, who'd had a terrific game. In Murphy's place, Crum inserted Terry Howard, an excellent ball handler and the team's best free throw shooter. In fact, Howard was perfect from the line for the year. But the wily old wizard of Westwood had one more lesson to teach his young protege. Wooden knew what to do. Foul the guy who's just come off the bench, the guy who's cold, the guy who's scared. Never mind what he's done this year. That was then and this is now. Make him hit some free throws. As Howard stepped to the line, Kurt Gowdy, the sports announcer for NBC, glanced at his stat sheet. And then he said it. Damn him to hell, he said it. "Whoa," Gowdy chortled, "they fouled the wrong guy. He hasn't missed one all year." Arrgh. I'm pretty sure that in that moment the entire city of Louisville screamed that collective scream. And of course the announcer's jinx worked. Of course poor Terry missed his first free throw. Of course UCLA got the rebound, and of course they scored the winning basket with just 4 seconds to go. Of course. I can still remember the Courier-Journal's headline the next day, "Wooden sees 2 UCLAs in great game." As soon as it was over, Wooden announced that the championship game against Kentucky would be his last. He had decided to retire. He waited until after the Louisville game, I remain convinced, because he wasn't sure that his UCLA squad could beat them. But he was sure that the Bruins would beat Kentucky, and they did. The outcome was never really in doubt. In the shell-shocked aftermath of that 1975 Final Four, there were naturally numerous discussions around town about what might have been. I was a student at the University of Louisville by then, so I'd have preferred to see the Cardinals win the hypothetical matchup with Kentucky, but much like I felt about the Bush-Gore battle that would rage at the start of the next century, I just wanted to see a good game. I was studying electrical engineering, and so I was being taught to be objective and analytical. Engineering and science students learn early on to use reliable and complete data sets to draw conclusions and to suppress their own innate prejudices while doing so. By looking at statistics and by watching their performances, it was obvious to me that Louisville was the superior team and that they most likely would have beaten Kentucky had they played them in the final, much as UCLA did. If Louisville and UCLA had played 10 games against one another that year, the probable outcome would have been 5 wins for each team. If UCLA and Kentucky had done the same, UCLA would probably have won at least 8 times. I knew it, and John Wooden knew it. During one what-if discussion with a friend and his brother, I offered up my observations. "No way," the friend's brother snarled, and then he launched into a racist tirade about how black Louisville could never beat white Kentucky. I was taken aback, but in deference to my friend, I didn't bother to argue with his brother. In 1975, the Louisville basketball team dressed 12 players, 10 of whom were black. Kentucky dressed 16 players, 5 of whom were black. Somehow, in the mind of my friend's brother, that made Louisville a black team and Kentucky a white team, and thus Louisville was inferior. My friend's brother was not alone, and I began to hear the same sentiment expressed over and over by other Kentucky fans. The brother also claimed that Wooden's retirement announcement provided his team with emotional adrenaline that boosted their performance. I found that claim to be ludicrous, but Kentucky fans everywhere seized on the same flawed logic. They couldn't see past their loyalty to their team, and in some cases their racism, to recognize that the Kentucky basketball team just wasn't as good as Louisville's that year. My own data sample was, of course, too small to draw any broad conclusions about their fan base, yet the stubbornness of the many Kentucky fans I met mystified me. But I was 18 years old in that spring of 1975, and this was my first real exposure to the large-scale effects of confirmation bias. The University of Louisville is a reasonably old school, and to capitalize on its age, the university's logo features a left-facing Roman warrior-looking guy like you might find on an old coin, and beneath him the number 1798 is inscribed. Apparently, around that year, some folks got together in the newly chartered town of Louisville, and they decided that it would be a good idea to start a school. They sat around for the next 15 years thinking about it, and then they opened one, and then they closed it, and then they opened another one in 1837 as a medical school, where they taught students all kinds of cutting-edge procedures like the fine art of bloodletting. It's possible that my description of the university's early histories does not align itself well with that of the school's official version, but in any event, I understand why they adopted the logo that they did. 1798 with a Roman warrior looks a lot cooler and more academically Ivy-like than does 1837 with an etching, say, of a bunch of well-meaning medical students bleeding some poor bastard to death. For about a century and a half, the city of Louisville ran its university until it couldn't anymore. After World War II, white flight to the suburbs eroded the city's tax base, and rising tuition prices made the school unaffordable for most Louisville kids. In 1970, despite opposition from inside and out, the University of Louisville became a part of the public university system of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Tuition prices dropped and a flood of new students poured in, but very few of them wanted to study engineering. I'd always wanted to study engineering. I wanted to work on flying machines, and in order to do that, I knew that I needed to know a lot about math and science. What I really wanted to do was to study aeronautical engineering, and I wanted to do that at Purdue University in Indiana. A bunch of astronauts majored in engineering at Purdue, including the first and last men on the moon, Neil Armstrong and Eugene Cernan. Gus Grissom, the second American to fly into space, studied there. It's quite possible that poor Gus would have been the first human to walk on the moon had he not been killed in the Apollo 1 fire of 1967. Roger Chaffee, who died with Grissom on Apollo 1, studied aeronautical engineering at Purdue. Chaffee never made it into space, but he flew dangerous reconnaissance missions as a Navy pilot during the Cuban Missile Crisis. These guys were my heroes, and I wanted to go to school where they'd gone. Unfortunately, the early 1970s were not a good time to pursue a career in aeronautical engineering. As the Apollo moon program wound down, aerospace engineers were seen leaving their resumes on car windshields around the Kennedy Space Center. There were news reports about laid-off Boeing engineers in Seattle pumping gas to earn money. There was the Arab oil embargo and long lines at the pumps. Inflation pressures and a little political grandstanding prompted Richard Nixon to impose a freeze on prices and wages, which shocked the hell out of everybody and only made matters worse. And then there was the problem of money. Purdue charged a hefty fee for out-of-state students, and to go there I'd need room and board. My father just simply couldn't afford it. I remember sitting with him at the kitchen table, going over numbers, talking about loans, summer jobs, whatever we could think of, trying to figure out how we were going to pay for Purdue. I remember the pained look on his face. He was willing to try, but the money simply wasn't there, and the prospect of going into debt frightened him. Finally, I told him, "Oh, to hell with it. I'll just stay at home and go to U of L." Maybe I said it because of the worried look on his face. Maybe it was because of the Boeing engineers pumping gas. Or maybe it was just because I was a lazy sack of shit and I took the easy way out. Later, my mother came to talk to me about it. "Don't tell him that I told you," she said to me, "but he's really relieved that you decided to stay at home and go to U of L." I wasn't really happy about my choice, but at least I knew that it would keep us all out of debt. When I finally started at Louisville, I briefly considered a major in mechanical engineering. Gus Grissom had done it, and he'd had a pretty good aerospace career, at least until the engineers at North American Aviation screwed up and killed him. But then I ran smack dab into thermodynamics and its inscrutable steam tables, and that frightened me away. Our thermodynamics instructor, Dr. Julius Wong, had studied in Hong Kong. He was a very good teacher, but he was keenly aware that his thick accent sometimes made him difficult to understand, and so he spoke to us slowly and deliberately. Around mid-semester, he started one class by saying, "A lot of you make errors on your homework that are unacceptable. Sometimes 99% correct is not good enough. For example, I give you $1. You pay me back 99 cents, I maybe say, okay. But I give you $1 million. You pay me back 990,000. I tell you, go to hell." We all laughed, but of course Dr. Wong had a point. His little joke made me start thinking about big numbers in a way that I hadn't before. What the hell is a million anyway? What the hell is a billion? How do you ever measure quantities like that? Can humans even conceive of what a billion anything is? A billion seconds is almost 32 years. What happens when you make a tiny little error when you're dealing with those kinds of big numbers? I thought about the old joke that was often passed around in political circles. You know, a billion here and a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. I'd always heard that the loquacious old Republican senator from Illinois, Everett Dirksen, said that. But the people who manage his archives say that he never did. Somehow electrons made more sense to me than steam did, and so I decided to major in electrical engineering. Our school made its students work as interns in industry for a few semesters before they were allowed to graduate, so in the summer of 1976 I was dispatched to Winchester, Kentucky, a few miles east of Lexington on I-64, to work for the South Central Bell Telephone Company. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in Louisville anymore. I was living in Kentucky. When I arrived in Winchester, it had been 100 years since Alexander Graham Bell first hollered at his assistant over a pair of wires, and for that whole century the equipment of the Bell system was pretty much the only way for people to talk to each other, unless they were in the same room. The Bell monopoly always pissed everybody off, and throughout its history people kept trying to break it up. To hide the fact that they were a monolithic monster, Bell's parent company, AT&T, created a bunch of divisions with regional and small-sounding names like South Central Bell. These baby bells were known as operating companies, and their job was to do the very unsexy work of setting up poles, running cables, building switching stations, and doing all of the other local crap that made telephony work. There was another division called long lines that got to do the fun stuff, like transmitting voice calls from New York to Los Angeles over microwave links. Everybody wanted to horn in on long lines' lucrative business, and regulators started allowing competition for long-distance service. The problem was that Bell's competitors were more than happy to carry your voice from New York to Los Angeles, but once it got there, nobody wanted to carry it from their equipment to the person you wanted to talk to. That job was left to the baby Bells, and because it wasn't practical to offer competition in their line of business, they operated as regulated utilities. The office where I worked was called Outside Plant Engineering, and we were tasked with the absolute unsexiest of all the unsexy baby Bell jobs. Around the U.S. there were, and still are, unobtrusive buildings called central offices, and these generally windowless places are crammed with switching gear, relays, and miles of cables that handle communications traffic and route it to their destinations. Our job was to string cables from those central offices to Bell's end users, wherever they might be, and in rural Kentucky, wherever was often a remote and lonely place. And it didn't matter how remote. As a regulated utility, we were obligated to provide service no matter what. Because I was just a lowly intern, I was assigned to tag along with the wise old engineers who knew their way around. We often had to explore deep into dense woods, conducting surveys so that we could figure out where to run pole lines or bury cables. One of our primary tools was a machete, and on one foray I hacked my way straight into a giant patch of poison ivy. I spent the next 2 weeks asking everybody in the office if they had a gun, and if so, would they please use it to put me out of my misery. There were about 24 people working in our office, including a husband and wife team who lived in some little town outside of Winchester. They had a long commute to work, but they said that it was worth it because Winchester was too big. I asked them what the population of their town was, and when they told me, I asked them, "Does that include all the pigs and chickens?" They just glowered at me. I knew that I had screwed up and insulted them, but I didn't care. I was a 19-year-old smart-ass shithead, and 19-year-old shitheads don't give a damn about anything. Our territory extended from Winchester eastward towards the Kentucky-West Virginia border, and I often found myself in the Appalachian Mountains and in tiny little towns with mysterious names like Elkatawa, which I was instructed to pronounce Elkatoy. The engineer I was most often assigned to work with, Steve, had grown up in eastern Kentucky, and he knew just about every nook and holler in the east half of the Commonwealth. Everybody said that he looked like Jimmy Carter, and he sort of did. On one ride-along, we drove up a dry creek bed to visit a guy he knew. The creek bed, Steve explained, was the guy's driveway, and when it rained hard enough, the guy was stuck wherever he happened to be. When we arrived at a little clearing, we found Steve's guy working on a flatbed boat. It had an airplane propeller on it. "What you doing?" Steve asked the guy. "I'm building me a swamp buggy," the guy replied. "Where are you going to run it?" Steve asked. The guy thought for a moment, and then he grinned. "I don't know." He had a kind of a wild look in his eyes. It hadn't been too many years since the movie Deliverance had appeared in theaters, and the look on that guy's face kind of intimidated me. There were a few land barons in eastern Kentucky who owned large swaths of territory, and of course Steve knew them all. He had to curry favor with them because often he had to ask their permission to run pole lines or bury cables across land that they owned. One day Steve invited a land baron to have lunch with us while we were in Jackson, Kentucky. During our conversation in a little diner, the baron just kept staring off into the distance, never making eye contact with anyone. He didn't appear to be on the spectrum or anything like that, and he was an active participant in our dialogue, but he just had a faraway look about him. Sometime near the end of lunch, the baron said, seemingly at random, "Yep, I about done everything in my life except fuck a man up the ass. Afraid to try it, afraid I might like it too much." And then he just kept staring off into the distance. I really didn't know how to react. Of course, I couldn't help but think again about Deliverance and wonder about how it was that I kept meeting all these real-life mountain stereotypes. I asked Steve if maybe we shouldn't be getting the check and wasn't it about time for us to start heading back to Winchester. I liked most of the guys I worked with. Generally, they were colorful, interesting characters with lots of fun stories to tell. One of my favorites was about a guy who called a telephone repair office with a problem. The story is almost certainly apocryphal, but I liked it anyway. It seems that the guy with the problem said, "My phone don't ring, but my dog always knows when I has a phone call 'cause he starts a-barking. Now how can that be?" "Well, I don't know," the bell repair guy answered. "Guess we better come and take a look." It's important to note that in the old days of landline telephony, a small cable was generally run from a pole into your house. Inside that cable were 4 little wires, and they connected directly to your telephone. 2 of those wires carried the signal with your voice, and the other 2 wires carried the ringing current that alerted your phone that a call was incoming. According to the story, this guy had spliced the cable that dropped from the pole into his house, and he used the 2 ringing current wires as a leash to tie up his dog. When a phone call came, the ringing current would deliver a mild electric shock to the dog, and the poor animal would holler, "Ow!" Just before the pandemic hit, while I was in London having dinner with a friend and his girlfriend, and probably after one too many glasses of wine, I started recounting a few of those old Bell telephone tales. My friend's girlfriend was a well-to-do woman from Myanmar, and she loved those stories so much that she asked me to repeat them in the best Kentucky twang I could muster so that she could record them on her phone to play at parties. Not long after that dinner, she and my friend broke up, and last I heard she was back in Rangoon, or whatever it's called now. When I think about it, it spooks me a bit to know that somewhere, sometimes, Burmese people are listening to my voice, talking about that creepy old land baron and that goddamn dog. It was another Tuesday, it was, the 12th of December, 2000. On that day, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered a halt to Florida's election recount, and in so doing, they handed the presidency of the United States to George W. Bush. Their decision stunned me. It stunned a lot of us. We knew that the court leaned conservative, but we couldn't believe that they would allow their partisan prejudice to influence an issue as important as this. In the days that followed, an analysis of the ballots in Florida revealed that a proper statewide recount could well have resulted in a win for Al Gore. But Antonin Scalia, that supreme asshole, convinced his majority conservative colleagues that a recount would have caused irreparable harm to the legitimacy of a Bush presidency. What the hell, I thought, this asshole is causing us irreparable harm. What about the legitimacy of the process? Justice John Paul Stevens said as much in his dissenting opinion. I daydreamed briefly about my Italian grandfather and Scalia's Italian father coming to America on the same boat. They would get into a fight and my grandfather would throw Scalia's father overboard. In the end, the officially recognized Florida election results said that Bush won the state by 537 votes out of almost 6 million cast. Al Gore won the national popular vote by over 500,000 out of more than 101 million votes cast. Besides the supreme slap in democracy's face, the Electoral College, that obsolete vestige of our horse and buggy Constitution, had subverted the will of the majority for the first time since 1888. It was quite possible that the election had been stolen from Al Gore. By putting a halt to due diligence, the Supreme Court had almost certainly stolen the election from the American people. I thought again about Dr. Wong's thermodynamics joke from all those years ago. Small errors, big numbers. To a guy who'd been trained to believe in the power of data, what I was witnessing was an abomination. I began to get angry. A lot of people I talked to were beginning to get angry. In 2003, Louisville and Jefferson County completed the merger that had been approved at the turn of the century. The police forces were combined. The governments were combined. The offices of Jefferson County Judge Executive, the de facto mayor of the county, were effectively eliminated. I always thought that county judge was a dumb name anyway. One time after a tornado tore through town, a network film crew arrived to report on the damage, and they interviewed the county judge, whoever it was. In their report, the crew referred to him as a county official. I don't blame them. Anyone who watched their report would have wondered why the hell they were talking to a judge about a tornado. The combination of governments made life a bit more difficult for local politicians who had higher office ambitions. A lot of county judges had tried to use the office as a springboard to bigger and better statewide gigs, but because of the whole Louisville, Kentucky thing, doing so made for a high degree of difficulty dive. But one county judge who nailed his jump off the springboard was a guy named Mitch McConnell. I hated him then and I hate him now, my buddy Terry told me during one of our shoot-the-shit sessions when the subject of Mitch came up, as it often did. Terry McCoy is a Dartmouth-educated lawyer who was born and raised in Louisville, and he'd gone to high school with Mitch. He's also one of only 3 people to ever beat Mitch McConnell in an election. Terry bested Mitch in a contest for junior high school student council president. In his mind-numbingly boring memoir, The Long Game, McConnell writes proudly about how he beat Terry for the same seat in high school, but he conveniently neglects his earlier loss. Mitch at least admits that Terry was a better student than he was, and that statement represents one of the very few times I've ever agreed with him. Terry McCoy is one of the most well-read and cerebral humans I've ever met. Terry told me that even as a little kid, Mitch McConnell was a mean, nasty, self-serving son of a bitch. In his book, McConnell recounts that he lost 2 more student council races while in college by 1 vote each time. He never lost again. It was yet another Tuesday, wasn't it, the 11th of September, 2001. When I called my mother that day, I asked her if the horrible events made her feel the same as she did after Pearl Harbor. They do, she told me, but Pearl Harbor was so far away and we had so little imagery. This is just so in your face over and over. Every 10 minutes they show it again. Her answer made me think again about what we'd been through together through the eyes of television. The scenes from Dallas and Arlington, the scenes from Los Angeles, and now the scenes from New York, Washington, and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. We were both watching Diane Sawyer on ABC that morning, and we traded notes about how strange it felt listening to Diane narrate the horrific events that played out on our screens. We knew the Sawyer family. We'd all gone to the same church. When she was a young woman, Diane was my sister's kiddie choir director. Because everyone knew that my father designed dishwashers at General Electric, they reasoned that he loved to fix appliances in his spare time. One day after church, Diane's mother cornered my father. Their dishwasher was acting up, and would he mind taking a look? Sigh. No problem, my father said. I was just a little kid, but I usually went with him on these house calls. He was the surgeon, and I was the nurse who passed him tools when he needed them. At the Sawyer house, while we were on our hands and knees, with dishwasher parts scattered all over the floor, Diane's father came into the kitchen. Urban Powers Sawyer, who of course everybody called Tom, was the sitting county judge. He was a big man with a hawkish but kindly face. As he came into the kitchen, his shoe grazed one of my pinky fingers, and I jerked my hand away. Worried that he might have hurt me, he knelt down, took my hand in his, and he began to gently rub my finger. I assured him that I was fine, but for about a minute he just held my hand and he looked me in the face, searching for signs of distress. I have a vivid memory of that big man with his big hawkish face hanging over mine. In his eyes there was kindness and compassion and genuine concern. We all knew that Tom Sawyer was destined for greatness, and we figured that he would follow the path that Mitch McConnell eventually did. But Tom Sawyer died in a car accident in 1969. He was a Republican, and I imagine that if I'd ever gotten the chance to talk to him about issues, I would have discovered at least a few topics on which we disagreed. But I would have voted for him in a heartbeat. Tom Sawyer was one of the finest gentlemen I ever met. This time it was a Thursday, the 20th of September, 2001. As we watched President George W. Bush address a joint session of Congress that evening, my wife and I were expecting a rousing and inspirational speech. We didn't get it. We kept waiting for him to utter the phrase, "another day that will live in infamy," but he never did. My wife is Canadian, and as W thanked other nations, we kept waiting for him to thank Canada, whose people had done more than anyone else to help stranded travelers on that terrible day. But he never did. I'd been scheduled to fly from Louisville to New York on Thursday, September 13th, 2001, and I was supposed to meet with a client in Manhattan that Friday. By 2001, I'd quit the corporate life, and I'd started a little IT consulting company. We were doing okay, and because I'd managed to turn myself into a pilot, I sometimes flew myself on business trips. I was grateful that I could afford to share a plane with a rich doctor friend and that I could pretty much use it whenever I wanted to, because he had another plane. Because, he was a rich doctor. I flew a lot up and down the northeast corridor of the U.S. and often on a route that gave me spectacular views of the Manhattan skyline. I fully realized how lucky and privileged I was. Very few people are ever able to get a pilot's license, even fewer have access to an airplane the way that I did, and even fewer still get to use that plane for anything other than buzzing around cow pastures. When my Manhattan meeting was rescheduled for near the end of September, I freely admit that I was spooked by the idea of getting on a commercial airliner. I certainly wasn't alone. Fortunately for me, I had the option of flying myself, and so on September 26th, I hopped into the little plane that I shared, and I flew from Louisville-Bowman Field to Essex County Airport in Caldwell, New Jersey. After the national airspace system reopened to civilian traffic, the FAA established no-fly zones for general aviation around New York and Washington. Essex County was the closest airport to New York that was outside their no-fly zone. By coincidence, it's also the airport where JFK Jr. kept his planes, and it was from Essex County that the poor guy departed on the last flight of his life in 1999. It was late afternoon when I arrived in the New York area, and as I approached the airport, I had a clear view once again of the Manhattan skyline. It was a very strange feeling looking at that skyline and not seeing the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. After I landed and parked the plane, I walked into the little terminal building. The place looked deserted except for a film crew from Fox 5 New York News. They were wandering around the empty airport looking for pilots to interview, but there weren't any, except for me. Poor local news. I've always felt a bit sorry for them because they never have anything to talk about. Well, almost never. A lot of local news channels have hours and hours of airtime to fill every day, but they rarely have anything to fill it with. One time, when I was watching a local news show in Burlington, Vermont, the lead story was about teenage drinking. Those darn teens, they're at it again. My hometown of Louisville, the 49th largest TV market in the U.S., has 4 major broadcast stations. They have big news crews. They have helicopters. But all too often they have nothing to hover over. Since helicopters are so hideously expensive to operate, 2 of the stations finally had the good sense to share one. They painted one station's logo on one side of the helicopter and the other station's logo on the other. It made their news division promo shots kind of tricky, but at least they saved a lot of money. One time, after a plane crashed somewhere far away, one local station sent a film crew to the Louisville airport to get some man-in-the-terminal reactions to the tragedy. The Louisville airport had absolutely nothing to do with the crash, but apparently they figured that interviewing some random passenger at the airport check-in counter would give their viewers a story with local flavor. It doesn't snow much in Louisville, especially not anymore, but local news loves it when it does. They dispatch reporters to intersections all over town. Here's the snow on Market Street. Here's a car that slid off into a ditch. Here's the snow on Eastern Parkway. It looks a lot like the snow on Market Street, Fred. One time when a huge snowstorm was predicted and it failed to materialize, all the local news stations were flummoxed. How could it not snow? They'd been counting on hours and hours of action cam coverage of the big blizzard. One sheepish news lady even started her evening's broadcast by saying, "Well, it didn't snow today." "Gee, lady," I hollered at the TV, "why don't you tell us what else didn't happen? That should keep you busy for a while." The Fox 5 team wanted to know what it was like flying into New York. They wanted to know what I'd seen. That seemed reasonable, I thought. I told them how strange it felt, and that it was more because of what I didn't see than what I saw. It took them about 5 minutes to get the footage that they wanted, and relieved that they'd finally found a human to talk to, they packed up their gear and took off. I called my buddy Tom Wood, who lived at the time in New Jersey, where he was working for Bell Labs. Tom is one of the most brilliant engineers I've ever met. We'd become buddies when we both worked in the same building on a military base in Germany. I was a civilian contractor working for McDonnell Don't Call Me Boeing Douglas. Tom was a Rensselaer grad and a captain in the Army, and he was in charge of a secure communications project. It was the early 1980s, and Tom showed me a workstation he was using to develop some software. Instead of the monolithic green screens that I was used to, the gizmo that Tom showed me had little windows all over its display. "See," he told me proudly, "I can use this joystick to move these windows around, and I can open as many as I want." I didn't understand why anybody would want to do that. When I called Tom, I told him that there was a chance that I was going to be on Fox 5 News that night, and could he please tape it? "No problem," he said. The next morning, while I was wandering around Manhattan, a guy came up to me and asked, "Hey man, are you a pilot?" Yeah, I told him. "Cool," he replied. "I saw you on TV last night." I had to shake my head and chuckle. A random New York sidewalk guy had seen me on Fox 5 News, and he recognized me on the street. I was famous for a New York 15 seconds. Because I was on TV, BFD. When Tom gave me the tape to watch, he explained that the video was pretty snowy. Fox 5 was transmitting from a backup TV tower. Their primary antenna had been on top of the World Trade Center. Our Manhattan customer wasn't too far from the Flatiron Building, and when my meeting finished, I decided that I had to walk down to the financial district. I couldn't help myself. I went straight down Broadway. It was closed to vehicular traffic, and there were cops everywhere. I walked past the Strand bookstore and its 18 miles of books banner. The Strand may well be the coolest bookstore on the planet. Once I got south of Houston, I began to smell it. All of lower Manhattan smelled like a fireplace, like it does the morning after you've used it. I made it to Fulton Street, and then I could see it. Jagged segments of building facade protruding from the rubble, just like the images that we've all seen. But suddenly this wasn't TV anymore. This was destruction and death that you could smell, that you could taste. It was far worse than what I could have imagined. I wondered what it must have been like for the poor people who were in it. I tried to imagine what it must be like for anyone who has to live in a war zone. I only lingered for a few minutes, and then I headed back north. I found nothing open in Soho except for one little bakery that was selling cookies. About a dozen people waited in a silent line to buy them, and I decided to join them. I think that we were all there less for the cookies than we were just for the ritual of doing something normal. It was a Wednesday, the 15th of May, 2002. On its evening broadcast, CBS News reported on the contents of a leaked memo, a part of the security briefing that's given daily to the President of the United States. The title of the memo was, "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S." It turned out that American intelligence agencies had been warning President George W. Bush and his administration repeatedly that al-Qaeda operatives appeared to be planning to hijack airliners in the United States. But Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney, and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld didn't take them seriously. When the CIA issued another report that said, more or less, "You really should take us seriously," Bush was reported to have answered, "All right, you've covered your ass." Damn. How could Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld have been so cavalier? I thought about how depressed the folks in the U.S. intelligence agency must have been. They'd seen what was coming, of course they had, but nothing had been done to stop it. I'd worked alongside a bunch of those guys. The military base in Germany where I'd met my buddy Tom was the headquarters of the U.S. European Command in Stuttgart. The place was chock full of intelligence analysts. Why would I want to work on a flying torpedo? Fighter planes are so much sexier. It was sometime in 1980, and I was talking to a guy I knew at the McDonnell Douglas Missile Systems Company in St. Louis. He was talking about Tomahawk cruise missiles. I'd gone to school with him. He'd graduated and taken a job at McDonnell Douglas the year before, and now I was there for an interview. By the time I graduated, the job market for engineers was booming, even in the midst of a terrible recession. Companies all over the U.S. were tripping over themselves to hire us, and we felt like prized basketball recruits. I ended up with 13 job offers. Some of my friends had many more than that. The only limit seemed to be how many trips we felt like taking. Plane tickets, hotels, dinners. It was intoxicating. All of us agreed that the most impressive interview process was with Exxon in Baytown, Texas, a suburb of Houston. It was the most physically massive city that most of us had ever seen. There were clusters of tall buildings everywhere. It looked like 10 Louisvilles. An Exxon host met us at the airport, drove us to our hotel, had dinner with us, met us for breakfast the next morning, gave us a slick spiral-bound book with pictures and bios of all the people we would meet during the day, escorted us to our first interview, was waiting for us when the interview ended, and then escorted us to the next, and the next. During one interview, an Exxon engineer showed me the office where I'd be working. It was bright with expansive windows, even though they only overlooked a tangled field of steaming refinery pipes. "I have to apologize," the engineer said, "but we have a space crunch right now, and you might have to share this office with another engineer for a while. But it's only temporary. We're working on an expansion." Wow, we had no idea. We all grew cavalier. I got so tired of hearing the standard "where do you see yourself in 10 years" question that I came up with a sarcastic answer. "Well, I'd say I'm a private pilot, and I have a buddy who's an Air Force pilot, and when he gets out, we're going to buy an old DC-3 and fly drugs across the border." Once, when I fed that stupid answer to an engineer at Martin Marietta in Orlando, his comeback was, "Well, hell then, in that case you ought to come down here to Florida. We've got more drug traffic than any place else in the world." I really liked that guy. He would have been a lot of fun to work for. "It's not a flying torpedo, it's a pilotless airplane. The technology is really cool," the McDonnell Douglas guy told me. I had an offer to work with him and another school friend. I also had an offer to work on F-15 fighter jets. "What the hell," I told him, "I'll give the missile thing a try." It was one of those road not taken moments that would make all the difference. 3 years later, I was in Germany working on the deployment of hundreds of nuclear-armed cruise missiles all over Europe. At the height of the old Cold War, the Soviet Union stationed 200 SS-20 missiles west of the Ural Mountains. They were sophisticated weapons, and each had a triple warhead. They could annihilate most of Europe in about 8 minutes. NATO countered by deploying American-made Pershing II and cruise missiles. They needed engineers to help with the deployment. Me, pick me, I hollered at the bosses at my department when they were looking for someone to send. And they did. Mostly because no one else wanted to go. The other engineers had lives, and wives. I had neither. "Hell yes, I'll go live in Europe," I told them. They wanted a 2-year commitment. I ended up staying for 10. HQ US UCOM, where I worked in the 80s and in the early 90s, was a strange place. It was run by the Army, but it was a joint command base, meaning that there were personnel from all 4 military branches running around. The enlisted Army guys had fun yelling, "Where's the water?" whenever they saw an enlisted Navy guy. The place was crawling with generals and admirals. The biggest cheese was a 4-star general whose direct boss was another 4-star, the Supreme Commander, Allied Powers Europe, and his office was at NATO military headquarters in Belgium. Dwight Eisenhower once held that job, as did constitutional scholar Alexander Haig and 2004 spin doctor Wesley Clark. All the offices had been in Paris until the late 60s when de Gaulle kicked them out. UCOM was also home to dozens of Navy captains and full-bird colonels, high-ranking officers who were used to commanding aircraft carriers, fleets of bombers, and thousands of troops. But at UCOM they were reduced to the roles of little bitches carrying the briefcases of their multi-starred bosses. There were so damn many generals on that base that one of them, a lowly 1-star, was assigned the role of running the commissary. Because of all the star power, the PX had to make sure that it carried the appropriate badges of rank, just in case one of their big guys needed some new uniform duds. One time I spotted a pair of 4-star shoulder boards there, so I bought them to sew on my bathrobe. I thought that it would be a cool thing to wear to parties. It was the 5th of February, 2003. Who gives a damn what day of the week it was? It was the day that Colin Powell lied his ass off to the United Nations. Weapons of mass destruction, chemical stockpiles, connections to Al-Qaeda. It was time to go kick some Iraqi ass, Powell told the UN, and you guys need to help us do it. Around that same time, as my wife and I watched on Canadian TV, the American ambassador made the same pitch to the Canadian Parliament. We're going to go beat up some Iraqis, the ambassador said, and you guys are going with us. Like hell we are, said the Canadians. You're not going to tell us what to do. We're not your 51st state. We're a sovereign nation. Go piss up a rope. NB, they didn't actually say the part about pissing up a rope. They just implied that it's what we should do. Politely, of course, because Canadians are polite people. Canadians are Americans with a conscience. After Powell's speech, the French ambassador told him to go to hell. In a very French way, of course. Everybody loved it. He wasn't as polite as the Canadians had been. Powell's speech depressed the hell out of me because I really liked him. It was obvious to anyone who watched him that he was an intelligent, measured, and thoughtful man. A lot of us hoped that he'd only said what he said because he was a good soldier. He'd been a 4-star general, but now he was just George W. Bush's little bitch. He served at the pleasure of the president, and the president's pleasure was to feed a line of bullshit to the United Nations. Powell spent the rest of his life saying as much. I knew I didn't have any choice, Powell once told the New York Times. What choice did I have? He's the president. What also depressed me was the way that people started beating up on the U.S. intelligence services. They'd gotten it all wrong, people said. Well, no, they hadn't. Sure, Powell found some people who were willing to say what W wanted to hear, but real people in the intelligence community knew better. I knew that they knew better. I'd worked alongside those guys, and I saw firsthand what they were capable of. They were among the best in the world. They were the best in the world. They didn't get things wrong, but they were powerless in the face of presidential confirmation bias. I was also depressed about Condoleezza Rice. I'd admired her greatly. She's an incredibly talented human and a true polymath. But by the time of Powell's speech, she joined the faculty of the George W. Bush dog-ate-my-homework school of excuses. My wife and I were in Bergamo, Italy when the shock and awe started. Bergamo's a beautiful town, a little northeast of Milan and not far from Lake Como, which has to be one of the most beautiful lakes on earth. Just ask George Clooney. We were on a business trip, as it turned out. I was trying to convince some skeptical Italians to trade us some of their euros for some of our services. It didn't go well, but I didn't care. We were having a good time. At least until the shock and awe started. When we arrived at the Bergamo train station, we discovered that there were no cabs. They'd all been scared away by a giant anti-war protest that was making its way toward the train station down the main thoroughfare. We had no choice but to drag our little wheelie suitcases in the opposite direction on a collision course with the crowd of protesters. The Italians were waving big, colorful Pace flags, and they were smiling and singing. We couldn't help but wonder if their mood would turn sour when they encountered a couple of ugly Americans dragging suitcases. We needn't have worried. They just marched right past us, and the crowd even parted to allow us to pass. I love Italians. I love Italy. How could anyone not? When we left Bergamo, we had to get up ultra early. As we waited for our train in the pre-dawn light, I joined the line to buy some coffee. Ahead of me was a young woman who was wearing a nose ring, one of those little hook thingies that pass in and out of each nostril with little balls at the ends that look like metal boogers. I was tired and I was crabby and I needed coffee, and this woman was standing between me and getting it. Her mere presence pissed me off. When I finally got what I wanted and made it back to where my wife was waiting, I remarked to her that I'd seen yet another pretty girl who'd messed herself up by sticking shit in her face. At least she's not bombing innocent civilians, another woman standing next to me said. I hadn't noticed her. She had shit in her face too. Oops. I went on the defensive. What the hell, I asked her. Do I look like I'm bombing anybody? I'm Canadian, my wife protested. Yeah, I chimed in, Canadian. I sensed that my wife had given us an opening, so I decided to run with it. Oh, sorry, the woman answered. You sounded like Americans. And there you had it. We Americans had had the warmonger tag hung on us, and that's a very difficult tag to remove. At the 2004 Cannes Film Festival, Michael Moore's film Fahrenheit 9/11 was awarded the Palme d'Or. I like Michael, and I agree with most of the messages that he pushes in his films, but let's be honest, he can be a bit of a demagogue at times. I found some of the messaging in Fahrenheit 9/11 to be over the top, but what resonated with me the most was his profile of a mother's anguish. Her son had been killed in Iraq. Moore's message was clear. Elitists, who had no clue what kind of hell war really is, sent a bunch of working-class Americans and Brits, as well as thousands of innocent Iraqis, to their deaths. Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz, the disgraced former head of the World Bank. He may have had more to do with the invasion than anyone else. In the iconic opening scene of the movie Patton, George C. Scott steps onto a stage in front of a giant American flag and he says, "No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country." And that's what war really is, isn't it? A bunch of poor dumb bastards dying for their countries. Because someone told them that they had to. Someone who has no fucking clue what it's like to suffer in hell. Someone who doesn't understand that war has to be the absolute last resort to save a country because there is no other way. Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz. 4 stars sending a bunch of poor dumb bastards to die for their countries. And for what? To overthrow one crass little dictator in a world full of crass little dictators? God only knows what their real motives were, but it seems clear, doesn't it now, that they were all a bunch of self-righteous asses, and they thought that what they were doing was justified because God was on their side. Be you the men you've been, get you the sons your fathers got, and God will save the queen, right, gentlemen? I began to grow angrier. A lot of people I talked to were growing angrier. Yes, it was a Tuesday, it was, the 2nd of November, 2004. This was supposed to be the day when the American people fired George W. Bush for his incompetence. Instead, it was the election day that made swift boating a thing. Bloggers chattered all day about exit polls and how they showed that John Kerry was going to win. He didn't. I got more depressed. A lot of people got more depressed. Norah Jones wrote a song about it. Republicans who'd increased their majorities in the Congress started making noise about how they were going to go after PBS and cut its funding. It's too left-wing, they said. It's not needed. Why bother watching American Experience when you can just watch the History Channel, they said. Why bother drinking Pappy Van Winkle when you can just drink dog piss, I said back. I loved PBS. I'll always love PBS. Frontline, Nature, Nova, American Experience, the PBS NewsHour, the only American news program worth watching, IMHO. It didn't cost much either. Taxpayer funding for PBS probably cost less than a spare tire for a B-2 bomber. Now I was really pissed. I decided that I had to do something. I talked to a lot of people who decided that they had to do something. We didn't know what, but we knew that we had to do something. I thought again about the effects of Dr. Wong's big numbers and small errors. Where would we be now if a President Al Gore had been sworn into office on January 20th, 2001? Would 9/11 have happened? Would we have gotten bogged down in the costliest, stupidest foreign policy mistake that the United States had ever made? Would European women with metal boogers in their noses be calling me a warmonger? Alas, we were 538 votes, a few hanging chads, and one supreme asshole away from ever finding out.